Th3Birdman recently posted a video called Exposing the Grift. Asmongold doesn't understand DEI and affirmative action, and it got a pretty bad dislike ratio. Honestly, I think the reaction is funny because the video itself feels like a perfect example of what is wrong with online political commentary. Even the thumbnail feels cheap. It is basically Asmongold in a strongman-style pose with DI slapped on it. The pose itself actually looks cool, but the framing is lazy. It feels like the thumbnail is trying to force him into an ideological villain role before the video even starts. The main problem is that the video seems to treat any criticism of DEI, affirmative action, or progressive institutional politics as right-wing grifting. That is just not serious analysis. It is ideological pattern matching. If someone says something that sounds even slightly outside the approved progressive framing, they instantly get boxed as conservative, reactionary, or grifter. That is the part one find annoying. Asmongold does not really fit cleanly into left or right. If anything, a lot of his values are fairly liberal or progressive, but because he disagrees on certain controversial issues, people act like those few issues define his entire worldview. That is herd thinking. One controversial take gets weighted more heavily than everything else someone believes. If people actually watched Asmongold videos instead of just reacting to clips or tweets, they would understand why people listen to him. He is blunt, simple, repetitive, and practical. He usually thinks in terms of what actually happens next instead of what sounds morally correct in the moment. That is rare online, where most commentary is just social signaling. That does not mean he is always right. He has been wrong before, and he has apologized when something went further than he expected. But at least he tries to think through second-order effects. A lot of creators just repeat whatever gives them the safest social position, and then act like they are morally superior for doing it. The "fuck I see" thing is a good example of that kind of behavior. A bunch of people say the socially approved phrase without really thinking about what it means in practice, what comes after it, or what incentives it creates. Asmongold usually does not operate that way. He may be wrong sometimes, but he at least tries to think past the first emotional reaction. That is why the constant character attacks in Th3Birdman's video do not really land for me. Instead of focusing purely on the argument, he keeps framing Asmongold as dishonest, stupid, or malicious. That might be entertaining, but it also makes the critique feel weaker. If the argument is strong, you should not need to constantly poison the audience against the person making the opposing point. Also, calling everything a grift is just lazy. A grift means someone knowingly sells a fake belief for money or attention. Being wrong is not automatically a grift. Having a different political instinct is not automatically a grift. Criticizing DI is not automatically a grift. The word has become a weapon people use when they do not want to ascribe the actual argument. It is the same thing that happened with words like racist, sexist, fascist, and Nazi. These words describe real things, but when people use them as generic insults for everyone they dislike, the words lose meaning. Then when the real thing actually appears, people stop taking the accusation seriously. The red and green circle thing in the video also feels obnoxious. This is not a live debate. It is a pre-recorded reaction video. Pausing and responding to whatever comes up is literally the format. You can criticize whether Asmongold responded to the strongest version of the argument, but acting like every pause is illegitimate just feels performative. The video overall comes off like it is trying very hard to be entertaining, which is fine. That is part of YouTube. But when the emotional framing becomes stronger than the actual argument, it starts to feel less like a serious critique and more like someone trying to socially punish Asmongold for not using the correct ideological language. And that is where the DI conversation actually matters. My stance is pretty clear. DI is anti-merit. You can argue about the intentions behind it, but the structure moves away from selecting primarily for competence and towards selecting based on group identity. Once you do that, you're no longer operating under a clean merit-based system. That creates obvious downstream effects. If people think jobs, admissions, promotions, or opportunities are not being given based on ability, trust in the institution drops. It also creates resentment because people start questioning whether someone earned their position or whether the system adjusted standards to produce a certain outcome. The cleanest system would be merit-focused. Intelligence would matter the most because IQ is one of the strongest predictors of performance across a lot of domains. After that, conscientiousness. If the goal is efficiency and stability, those traits should be weighted more than identity categories. Such a system is portrayed in Brave New World. It shows the logic of a fully optimized society. People are sorted into roles based on capacity and function. Obviously, real life is messier than that, and nobody wants to live in a rigid artificial class system. But the underlying point is that stable systems depend on people being placed where they are actually competent. A truly meritocratic system would try to identify the highest performing people from every group and elevate them based on ability, not because of race, not because of signaling, and not because institutions want to look morally righteous, but because competence is what actually keeps systems functional. That is why I think the DEI defense often feels dishonest. People act like the only reason someone could oppose DEI is racism or right-wing grifting, when the obvious objection is that DEI interferes with merit. If you care about performance, standards, and institutional trust, then DEI is not some harmless moral upgrade. It is a trade-off, and people should be honest about that